McEwan pertenece a aquella generación en la que están pues, Martin Amis, está Salman Rushdie, está Katsuo Ishiguro y tantos otros. Y bueno, McEwan es un novelista excepcional, por supuesto, y se puede hablar de su técnica, de su estilo, de esas estructuras endiabladas, de la forma que tiene de jugar con el lector, pero a mí lo que particularmente me entusiasma y que creo que lo singulariza mucho es el gran impacto, ¿no?, de sus obras, como nos golpean, digamos, de una manera muy especial, ¿no? Yo creo que si la imaginación del lector contara con algún tipo de retina interna, quedarían grabadas para siempre muchísimas escenas de sus novelas de forma indeleble. Para los que conozcan bien su obra, puedo poner ejemplos como el descuartizamiento del inocente o el niño que se pierde, que su madre lo pierde de vista, en Niños en el tiempo, escalofriante, o el accidente de globo aerostático en Amor perdurable, o tenemos la nefasta noche de bodas de Chesapeake Beach, o la excursión por el Ártico y el problema con la cremallera que tiene el protagonista de Solar, muy divertidos. Y luego también está obviamente el McEwan prestidigitador, ¿no?, el trilero, aquel que hace contigo, digamos, con el lector lo que quiere, lo que le viene en gana, el McEwan de Ámsterdam, de Expiación, y también de esta novedad, Operación Dulce, Operació Carmel, en catalán, que es capaz de darte un giro final que te descoloca y te deja, digamos, clavado en el asiento, ¿no? McEwan también es un autor muy interesado en las ciencias, eso aporta también discurso científico, sus polémicas, sus últimos descubrimientos, ha introducido la neurociencia, el cambio climático, y también lo singulariza, ¿no?, el hecho de estar muy interesado en el diálogo entre literatura y ciencia, eso también lo hace muy especial. Y bueno, para ir acabando, hoy nos reúne la publicación de su última novela, Operación Dulce en anagrama, Operació Carmel en Empúries, en catalán, que nos transporta al año 1972, o sea, en el marco de la Guerra Fría, y donde encontramos a una pipiola, una chica, bueno, muy normalita, que tiene un punto inocente, que le encanta leer y que de forma azarosa se encuentra fichada por el MI5, el Servicio de Inteligencia Británico para Asuntos Internos. Empieza como secretaria y, bueno, una labor muy rutinaria, muy oficinesca, pero de golpe se ve, le encomienda una misión, que es que el MI5 tiene un departamento, digamos, que utiliza una fundación, que es una especie de tapadera, por la cual intenta realizar propaganda anticomunista, fichando a artistas, también escritores, que sin saberlo están trabajando para ellos de forma ideológica, manipularlos ideológicamente, aunque el artista no lo sabe, ¿no? Y esta autora se encarga de intentar pues que un escritor trabaje, digamos, de forma encubierta para el MI5. Total, la chica se enamora y la cosa se complica, y de ahí, bueno, un torbellino de emociones, digamos. Y es una novela excelente por muchos motivos, porque es muy proteica, ahí participa de todo. O sea, tenemos realmente una novela de espionaje, que es de lo que más se ha hablado, pero también es una historia de amor, por supuesto, también tiene un punto de thriller erótico, pero luego también es una reflexión sobre la novela y sobre el lector, y cómo leemos, y hasta qué punto nos dejamos engatusar y somos inocentes como lectores, ¿no? Y por supuesto es un juego de astucia y de ocultación que también se va a hacer el trilero McEwan, ¿no? Y bueno, dicho todo esto, podemos ya empezar con la entrevista, que sería el momento de colocarnos los zapatos. So, Mr. McEwan, hello.
Call me Ian. Yes, please call me Ian.
Yeah. Hello, Ian. So the first question, as a young man, you had a fleeting dream about becoming a diplomat. Yes, but only recently you applied online to become a member of the MI5. But both prospects ended in failure. I don't know if you could explain us a bit how both went.
Not many people apply to MI5 in their mid-60s. No, it was a little experiment. It was part of my researches. I sat down with my son, who was 25 at the time, and we applied online to MI5 because that's the first stage of the screening process. And I was interested in this curious shift in the culture of what was once a very secretive organization, which now advertises in the national newspapers for recruits. And indeed, the Director General often will appear on public lectures. We now know, it used to be an official secret, which building was at the MI5 headquarters, so everybody in London knew exactly which one it was. So we sat down in front of the computer, and it said you have 1 hour to answer as many questions as you can. Multiple choice. So we got to the first question, and it was 500 words. The questions were all the same, 500 words or so, and I always remember the very first question was on the migratory habits of Canadian geese. Very useful to know if you're in MI5. And then there were some questions, but it wasn't like a standard comprehension test you might get in school. These questions were rather oblique, quite interesting. So I said to my son Greg, oh, it's obvious, it's A. And he said, no, it's obvious, it's C. It followed then a 10-minute conversation. And so we went on, and only 3 questions were answered, and then the hour was up. And then it said, 1 second later, the little dialogue box came up and said, you have failed. You are not permitted to apply again for another year. So it was just a little experiment, really, to probe the strange public face of the intelligence services. And yet we know very well from the scandal of the NSA surveillance of en masse of Spanish population, Angela Merkel, whoever you name, the secrecy remains the same. So what we're looking at is actually a public relations exercise of accountability of the intelligence services. But of course they need secrecy, they would be useless without it. But it was an interesting, just a little taste of how things are.
What about the diplomat phase?
Oh, the diplomat. Well, I mean, to be a diplomat is a very different thing. I was 21 years old, I just finished my degree. I already knew in my heart that I wanted to be a writer. But I thought, well, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'll never make it, maybe I should have a job. So I went to the careers office and said to the careers officer, what about if I join the diplomatic service? He said, yes, here we are. And he gave me a pamphlet, and on the back I could see ages, down one side it said 21 all the way down to 65. And you read along and you could see your salary going from £680 as it was in 1970 to £13,000 in 2013, which I'm 65 now. And it just so horrified me to see my whole life. But my fantasy was to be, and it's a very English fantasy, was to be not in a suit and tie, eating canapes, but to be on a camel, riding towards Baghdad, speaking fluent Arabic, with all the verses of Shelley and the prose of T.E. Lawrence in my mind. So it was a hopeless little experiment.
And now that you are very much onto the spy world and doing the research also, which are the most preposterous false myths that, regarding the spy world, that I guess made intoxications by watching Bond movies that we are more, running around?
Well, I went, when this novel was published, I got invited by MI5 to come and speak in their London headquarters. And I went in beautiful atrium and 500 people, and they looked to me like students at any university. And I had prepared, I thought, oh my God, this is going to be so interesting, and I'm really going to be on top of my game. So I prepared a lecture on the Cold War and on the cultural Cold War. And I dug up some primary sources, and I thought this would be very interesting to get in a dialogue. I delivered my lecture, there was polite applause, and then some questions. And the first hand went up, and a young woman said, could you tell us a little bit about your working day? And then the next question was, I never really understood at the end of Atonement why you... Then the next question was, what did you think of the movie of Atonement? And I thought I was in MI5. In other words, either I was confronting an amazing, sophisticated screen of a brilliant deception, which they just made themselves look like everybody else, or they weren't very interesting. So I don't know.
You also went to John Le Carré for advice, is that true? Did you talk to him?
I had lunch with Le Carré, and a writer friend brought us together, Timothy Garton Ash, who's an old friend of David Cornwell, which is Le Carré's actual name. And we had a very good discussion. I mean, he is the last of that generation in the tradition of English spy writers who actually had real experience working for both MI5 and MI6. And he told me, the one story he told me that I put in the book, and I wrote to him and said, can I use this? And he said, my dear boy, yes, of course you can. How nice in your 60s to be called my dear boy. He said that you have lots of really good colleagues in MI5, but you never know whether they are complete idiots or amazing geniuses, because they can never tell you what they're doing, and you have no idea whether they're any good. And when they disappear, you never know whether they've been promoted or sacked. And I thought, well, this is a kind of strange existential problem, working in such an environment.
And you have said that you put a lot of view about yourself in the character of the writer, Tom Healy. And as happens with him, you were working without your knowledge, for a governmental instrument. In the case you collaborated with this magazine, Encounter, was it the 70s? Yes.
And the CIA, it was a scandal in the mid-60s. It came out in 1966, and then there was a big piece in the New York Times in 1967. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a very powerful cultural organization in Europe, was funding two magazines, Encounter and Der Monat in Germany. Both very good magazines, actually. Every writer I knew, every one of my generation, would try and publish in Encounter. But that was a little later. But then it came out that they were funded by the CIA. Stephen Spender was the editor at the time, and he resigned. Melvin Lasky, who was a key figure in Cold War politics, was actually working for the CIA. Then everything quietened down, and actually Encounter went on for many years afterwards, and got its money from somewhere else, so it was okay to just go on publishing with them. But it's a curious, really a curious history. From about 1948 onwards, the CIA decided that they must counter Soviet communist cultural propaganda with a propaganda campaign of their own. And they started to, using these fronts like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, they started to fund all kinds of artistic activities, even like an evening like this. Literary events, literary conferences, money to publishers. They had tours of American abstract expressionist painters. They funded a festival of atonal and contemporary music in Paris, which was a huge success. The Boston Symphony Orchestra toured Europe. And the purpose was to persuade European intellectuals, and they were particularly interested in Germany, and then later France and Italy, because they had flourishing communist parties. They wanted to persuade them that pluralism, creative energy of free expression and so on, was better than the Red Army Choir, or whatever you like to think of. And because many of these CIA people were themselves Harvard and Yale professors, they had extremely good taste. And their projects were perfectly good ones from my point of view. I would have thought that anyone would favour freedom of expression and the open society. But, and this is the paradox that drew me to this novel, they did it all in secret. All of this could have been funded directly by government. You could have said, the American government proudly presents the Boston Symphony Orchestra, or abstract expressionism, or the music of John Cage. But no, they did it in secret. And they poisoned the well right from the beginning. And that's what really drew me into this, because I thought, here is a world of the intelligence agencies penetrating the milieu, the environment of the imagination. And surely that's where a literary spy novel should live, right at that point. And maybe, I thought to myself, I could write the revenge of that milieu by having a spy on a novelist, but have the novelist spy on the spy. And because it's a spy novel, they must, the rule is the rule, they must fall in love. That was how it began.
And now every day we open the newspaper, on the headlines we find more news about how our privacy is invaded by intelligence agencies. Are these very exciting times for novelists, or is reality in a way definitely surpassing any feat of the imagination?
Well, I think that we're now confronting technology that George Orwell didn't even begin to dream of. That you could watch people on such a scale, even if it's only generalized data, or even if it's only algorithm searches for keywords in conversations. It is still extraordinary. And I think it teaches us one or two very important things. One is that if it's possible to do it, the intelligence agencies will do it. If the capability is there and the money is there, they cannot resist it. And that was really what I was interested in here, that no one is actually a Machiavel, no one is evil here. It's just the next thing. And you've got the extra $500 million, you've got someone telling you from some corporation, we've now got an amazing new piece of software, we've got an amazing piece of hardware. Organizations and universities and libraries and government departments are all the same. They always want to get bigger. There's no human institution that ever resists the temptation to get larger. I mean, it's just, the only institution that does remain roughly the same size is the family. Unless you're brought up in the Yemen or something. So there are the machines, but the human story. I mean, I think the story of Edward Snowden is a fantastic story. He's sitting in Moscow. He assures us that he did not take with him the files to, I don't know whether that's, who knows if that's true. The Bradley Manning story is possibly even more interesting. The Julian Assange story, there you see the human element, because nearly everyone who has got close to Julian Assange in the end ends up being rejected by him. So I mean, he has a real problem of personality. So the human element remains. I mean, there's no way around it. The machines are extraordinary and powerful, but the human story is absolutely fascinating. I mean, this whole thing, 35 allies of the United States, American ambassadors sweating as they are hauled out to confront the Spanish government, the German government, down to one man. Quite interesting.
With the Cold War,
no? We're dealing really with another consequence of 9/11. At the end, when the Commission on 9/11 was published, one of its recommendations is that all the American intelligence agencies should be joined up. They should share their information, which is quite a rational suggestion, but suddenly it means you have a secret and 3 million people are party to that secret, which means, of course, the human element being what it is, sooner or later along will come Bradley Manning or Edward Snowden, and you can't. 3 million people can't keep a secret. It's just not possible.
And writing within a genre, in this case, a spy novel, means having to follow certain rules and to respect certain laws. I don't know, was that more fun and liberating than limiting? Did it pose a special challenge? How was that?
I think that many, for want of a better word, mainstream literary writers like myself are tempted now and then to write a genre novel. I mean, William Boyd's just published a James Bond novel. Zadie Smith tells me she's writing a science fiction novel, and can't wait to read that. Martin Amis is a detective novel. Why do we do it? I think 2 reasons. One is there's a curious kind of energy that comes from a genre novel. The genre novel, because it's popular, has a sort of intimate, direct connection with a wide readership. And the wide readership was where the novel began. The great novelists of the 19th century had, by any standards, enormous readership. Tolstoy, Dickens, George Eliot. They were read widely and they were powerful in the culture. Sometime in the 20th century, with early modernism, the view began to seep through the culture that art was like a kind of priesthood, and only very specially qualified people who had studied how to read could really read these books. And any novel that sold more than 200 copies was highly suspect. And this was a poisonous idea. But the genre novels, they don't care about that. They don't care what it says in the literary periodicals. So they have a kind of raw energy that maybe the mainstream novel has slightly, to some extent, lost. So that also when you move to one of those forms, you are aware of the conventions. I mean, when we say rules, they're only there to be broken. But you're at least aware of them, and there's a delight too in subverting or playing around with things. And I have to say that this, although the subject is serious and the nature of surveillance and deceit and betrayal is all very serious matters, because I was also dealing with the literary element in this, it was quite a playful exercise to write this novel. I think I had more fun with it than any novel I've ever written. In most novels, there are stretches, especially in the middle, where you are always tempted to just give up. You think another day on this and I'll go mad. Whereas this, I felt sort of buoyed up by just being out of the mainstream and into the genre.
You have told me that you don't see yourself writing a James Bond novel, but you see yourself writing a science fiction novel maybe one day.
Well, I've promised it to myself for years. I'd like a science fiction novel that keeps within the laws of physics, as we know. I don't like... I mean, one of the problems with science fiction novels is when you you read that, they always have names like Clerk. He presses the accelerometer and suddenly he's 5,000 light years across the galaxy. Then I think, well, if he's 5,000 light years across the galaxy, he must have reached the speed of light and beyond, not permissible as we know it. Also, his mass would have approached infinite as you approach the speed of light.
So is there any particular field of physics that you would like to write about?
No, I mean, I've had notes on this for years and I've really not got serious about it. I was very interested, when Higgs got the Nobel Prize. I mean, so many people were involved in that process of theoretically defining the Higgs particle and the extraordinary effort to locate it. A particle that's everywhere in the universe that conveys gravity on mass. You think it would be the easiest thing in the world to find. It's everywhere. But it's only everywhere very briefly. Somewhere in there, there's lots to be done.
You read a lot about science?
Yeah.
Did you have a plan about following a career in science when you were young?
I did for a while. In the English education system, I don't know how it is in Spanish, but in Spain, but around about the age of 16, you basically have to face a forking path, like as if you were a character in a story by Borges. And down one is the humanities, down the other are the sciences. And I was really conflicted for a long time. And even when I chose the humanities, I kept thinking, when I finish this, I could go back and do a science degree. But then that faded, largely because we've lived through these last 30 years a wonderful age of science writing, where you don't have to be a scientist, you can just enjoy science. Like, you can enjoy music without being a composer. I mean, there's just, as a celebration of human ingenuity, you can just indulge it, because there have been so many good expositors of it.
Let me read this. Sweet Tooth is also a novel about how many different readers there are, and about how we read books. Even us, the readers of Sweet Tooth, believe we are reading a kind of book that turns out to be not exactly what we thought. Was this planned from the beginning, or it came up later?
It was planned from the beginning, although what you asked me, what was planned from the beginning? The fact that we can't trust the narrator, I suppose, is the question. It's irresistible, I think, in a spy novel to not trust the narrator. Generally, spy novels are written in the first person because it's a limiting point of view. And one of the tasks of the writer of a spy novel is to control very closely the flow of information to the reader, and also limit the flow of information to the characters. Now, I think the great trick, the rhetorical triumph of Le Carré is he writes in the third person, an omniscient third person. It's a God's eye view. And yet he still limits the information, he still deceives the reader, he still throws the false trails to the characters. But I've always been very suspicious of the first person, for a whole set of other reasons. But I found myself drawn right to it for just those reasons, to give Serena, my female spy, her space, and let her not know everything. The first person was.
What does it like the secret to pull the trick off, to make it really work? Is there any trick, to make it work, You talk about to make all the game, sustain all this game until the end. I mean,
yeah.
We talked about how it has to be very realistic in order to
yeah. I mean, I should explain that Serena, as a narrator, is a young woman who goes to Cambridge. She does maths. She's not very good at it, but and then she finds